Daniel had been living in that small mountain town for 3 years now, and he'd gotten pretty good at being alone. After his marriage fell apart, he just couldn't handle the noise of the city anymore, couldn't handle running into people he knew, couldn't handle the questions and the sympathy. So he packed up what mattered and moved to his grandfather's old cabin, the one that had been sitting empty since he was a kid. The place needed work, but that was fine. He had time, and fixing broken things felt easier than fixing himself. He worked from home, writing code for companies that didn't care where he lived as long as he met his deadlines. Most days followed the same pattern. Wake up, make coffee, work, take a walk, work some more, eat dinner, read a book, sleep. It wasn't exciting, but it was safe. No drama, no heartbreak, no disappointment. Just him and the mountains, and the quiet that had become his closest companion. The town itself was small enough that everyone knew everyone, but the locals had learned to leave him alone. They'd nod when they saw him at the grocery store, maybe comment on the weather, but they didn't push. They understood that some people came to the mountains to find themselves, and some came to hide. Daniel was definitely in the second category, though he'd never admit it out loud. His cabin sat at the edge of town where the forest started to thicken, right next to a hiking trail that tourists used during the warmer months. By October, though, most visitors had gone home, and Daniel had the mountainside pretty much to himself. That's how he liked it. The changing leaves were beautiful, sure, but he'd stopped really looking at them. They were just there, like everything else. On that particular evening, Daniel was sitting on his porch with a beer, watching the sun drop behind the peaks. The air had that crisp bite that meant winter wasn't far off. He was thinking about nothing in particular, just letting his mind drift, when he saw movement on the trail. A woman was walking toward his cabin, moving fast but looking around like she wasn't quite sure where she was going. That wasn't unusual. Hikers got turned around all the time, especially as it got darker. He figured she'd pass by, maybe wave, and that would be that. But she stopped at the edge of his property, pulled out her phone, stared at it with obvious frustration, and then looked up at the sky. That's when Daniel noticed the clouds rolling in from the west. They were dark and moving fast, the kind that meant serious rain, or worse. The temperature had already dropped a few degrees in the last hour. The woman noticed him then, seemed to debate with herself for a moment, and then walked up to his porch. She was probably in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and a camera bag slung over one shoulder. Her hiking boots were muddy, and she looked exhausted. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, and her voice had an accent he couldn't quite place. "My phone died, and I think I took a wrong turn about an hour ago. I'm trying to get back to town, but I'm not sure which direction anymore." Daniel stood up, looked at the sky again, and felt that old instinct kick in, the one that used to make him help people before he'd decided that helping people just led to complications. "There's a storm coming," he said. "Bad one from the looks of it. Town's about 2 hours that way if you know the trails, but in the dark with a storm, you're not going to make it safely." She followed his gaze to the clouds, and he could see the worry cross her face. "I'll be fine," she said, but she didn't sound convinced. "I just need to know which trail." "You could try," Daniel said slowly, surprising himself with what he said next. "Or you could wait out the storm here. I've got a guest room. It's not fancy, but it's dry and warm." She looked at him for a long moment, clearly weighing her options, and probably wondering if accepting help from a stranger in the middle of nowhere was a terrible idea. He almost took the offer back, almost said never mind, almost retreated back into his comfortable isolation, but something made him wait. "Are you sure?" she asked finally. "I don't want to impose." "Storm's going to hit in about 20 minutes, he said, which wasn't really an answer but was the truth. "Your choice." She looked at the sky one more time and then nodded. "Okay, thank you. My name is Victoria." "Daniel," he said, and opened the door to let her in, wondering what he'd just agreed to and why his carefully constructed, quiet life suddenly felt like it was about to get complicated. The first drops of rain started to fall as he closed the door behind her, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled across the mountains. The storm had arrived, and Daniel had a feeling it was going to change more than just the weather. The storm hit harder than Daniel had expected. Within an hour, rain was hammering the roof like fists, and the wind made the old cabin creak in ways that reminded him he really needed to fix that loose board on the north side. Victoria stood by the window in the living room, watching the trees bend and sway, her camera in her hands like it was a security blanket. "I've seen storms before," she said quietly, "but not like this." Daniel brought her a towel and a mug of tea. Mountain storms are different. They come fast and mean it. He'd started a fire in the fireplace, and the cabin was warming up nicely despite the chaos outside. "You said you took a wrong turn. Where were you trying to go?" She accepted the tea with a grateful smile and sat down on the couch. "I'm a photographer, travel photography mostly. I was up here shooting the fall colors for a magazine assignment, and I wanted to catch the sunset from the ridge. I thought I knew the trail, but everything started looking the same after a while." "Easy to do," Daniel said, settling into the chair across from her. "The trails all connect up there. If you don't know the markers, you can end up miles from where you meant to be." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm. It should have been awkward, having a stranger in his space after 3 years of solitude, but somehow it wasn't. Maybe it was because she didn't seem to need constant conversation. She just sat there drinking her tea, occasionally glancing at him with curious eyes, but not pushing. "So you live up here alone?" she asked eventually. "Yeah," Daniel said. 3 years now." "By choice?" He considered lying, giving some generic answer about loving nature and needing space to work. But something about the way she asked made him tell the truth. "Mostly by choice. I got divorced, needed to get away from everything, and this place was sitting empty. Seemed like a good idea at the time." Victoria nodded slowly. "And is it? A good idea, I mean?" Daniel looked at the fire, watching the flames dance. "Some days yes, some days no. But it's easier than the alternative." "Which is?" "Being around people," he said with a slight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "People are complicated." "They really are," Victoria agreed, and something in her voice made Daniel look up. There was a sadness there, hiding behind her friendly exterior, the kind of sadness that came from real loss, not just disappointment. The lights flickered then, once, twice, and then went out completely. The fire provided enough light to see by. But the cabin suddenly felt smaller, more intimate. Daniel grabbed a couple of battery-powered lanterns from the closet and set them on the coffee table. "Happens a lot up here," he said. "Power usually comes back by morning." But morning came, and the power didn't. The storm had knocked down trees, taken out power lines, and turned the mountain roads into rivers of mud. Daniel checked his phone and saw the emergency alert. Roads closed. Power crews working. Estimated restoration time unknown. He showed Victoria the message. "Looks like you're stuck here for a bit," he said. She should have looked worried or frustrated, but instead, she just nodded. "Well, I've been in worse situations. At least your cabin is comfortable and you don't seem like an axe murderer." "How can you tell?" Daniel asked, genuinely curious. "Axe murderers don't usually have 4 different kinds of tea and books organized by genre," she said, gesturing to his kitchen and bookshelf. "They also don't rescue stranded photographers from storms." Despite himself, Daniel laughed. It felt strange, that sound coming out of his mouth. He couldn't remember the last time he'd really laughed. Fair point. As the day wore on, they fell into an unexpected rhythm. Daniel made breakfast while Victoria looked through the photos on her camera, showing him some of the places she'd been: Tibet, Iceland, Patagonia, Morocco. Every image told a story, captured some moment of beauty or strangeness or human connection. "You're really good," Daniel said, meaning it. "These are incredible." "Thank you," Victoria said softly. "Photography is how I make sense of the world, you know? When everything feels too big or too overwhelming, I can look through a lens and find something small and beautiful to focus on." "Is that why you travel so much? Because things feel overwhelming?" She was quiet for a moment, and Daniel thought maybe he'd pushed too far, asked something too personal. But then she set down her camera and met his eyes. "My sister died 2 years ago," she said. "Car accident. She was my best friend, my anchor, the person who knew me better than anyone. After she was gone, I couldn't stay in one place. Everything reminded me of her. So I started traveling, kept moving, and convinced myself I was living this amazing, adventurous life. But really, I was just running." Daniel understood that more than she knew. "I'm sorry about your sister." "Thank you," Victoria said. "What about you?" "What are you running from?" And just like that, in a cabin with no power while a storm raged outside, Daniel found himself telling his story to a woman he'd just met, opening up in ways he hadn't with anyone in years. The storm kept going through the second day, and by the third morning, Daniel and Victoria had talked about everything and nothing. She told him about growing up in Portugal, about her sister Sophia, and how they'd planned to open a gallery together someday. He told her about his marriage, how it had fallen apart slowly and then all at once, how he'd stopped recognizing himself in the mirror by the end of it. "The worst part wasn't even the divorce," Daniel said as they sat on the porch watching the rain. "It was realizing that I'd spent so many years trying to be what I thought I should be that I'd forgotten who I actually was. And when it all fell apart, I had no idea how to find my way back." Victoria wrapped her hands around her coffee mug. "Have you found your way back?" "I thought I had," Daniel said. "I thought coming up here, being alone, working on the cabin, that was the answer. And maybe it was for a while. But lately, I don't know. It feels less like healing and more like hiding." "I know that feeling," Victoria said quietly. "Every time I book a new flight, tell myself I'm chasing the next great shot. Part of me knows the truth. I'm terrified to stop moving because if I do, I'll have to actually deal with the fact that Sophia is gone and she's never coming back." The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and shafts of sunlight were starting to break through the clouds. Everything smelled fresh and clean, like the earth was starting over. Daniel looked at Victoria and saw his own struggle reflected back at him. Two people who'd been hurt, who'd chosen opposite responses to their pain, but who'd ended up in the same place, alone and pretending it was a choice rather than a fear. "Want to go for a walk?" he asked. "The trails will be muddy, but the waterfalls are probably incredible right now." Victoria's face lit up. "Can I bring my camera?" They spent the afternoon hiking through the dripping forest, Victoria stopping every few minutes to photograph something Daniel would have walked right past. A mushroom growing on a fallen log. Water droplets caught in a spider's web. The way the light filtered through the leaves. She moved with such focus and joy when she was shooting, completely present in the moment in a way Daniel hadn't felt in years. "How do you do that?" he asked, as they stood by a waterfall that was thundering down the rocks, swollen from the rain. "Stay so present." Victoria lowered her camera and looked at him. "It's the only time I'm not running. When I'm shooting, I have to be right here, right now. I can't be thinking about the past or worrying about the future. I just have to see what's in front of me." Daniel watched her for a moment. This woman who'd stumbled into his life 3 days ago, and felt something shift in his chest. "Teach me." "Teach you what?" "To see things the way you do. To be present like that." Victoria smiled and handed him her camera. Okay. Find something that catches your attention. Doesn't matter what it is. Just something that makes you feel something. Daniel looked around, feeling awkward and self-conscious. Everything looked the same as it always did. But then he noticed the way the water was creating rainbows in the mist, tiny fragments of color appearing and disappearing in the spray. He lifted the camera and tried to capture it. "That's it," Victoria said softly, standing close behind him. "Now forget about making it perfect. Just let yourself feel whatever you're feeling." Daniel clicked the shutter, and for just a second he wasn't thinking about his failed marriage or his self-imposed isolation or anything else. He was just there, watching light and water create something beautiful and temporary. When he lowered the camera, he found Victoria watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "What?" he asked. "You have a good eye," she said. "But more than that, you let yourself feel something. That's rare." They walked back to the cabin as the sun started to set, and Daniel realized he didn't want this to end. The storm was clearing, which meant the roads would be passable soon, and Victoria would leave. She had an assignment in Iceland, a life that required movement, and he had his cabin and his solitude and all the safety that came with it. That evening, they cooked dinner together, moving around the small kitchen in easy coordination. Victoria told him stories about the people she'd met on her travels, the kindness of strangers, the unexpected connections. Daniel found himself laughing again, telling his own stories from before he'd retreated to the mountains, remembering the parts of himself he'd thought were gone forever. "I should check the road conditions," Victoria said after dinner, pulling out her phone, now charged. Her face fell as she read the screen. "Highway's open. I could probably make it to town tomorrow morning." "Yeah," Daniel said, trying to keep his voice neutral. "You probably could." They sat in silence for a while, and Daniel felt the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. He wanted to ask her to stay, but what would be the point? She had a plane to catch, a career that took her all over the world, and he had a cabin and a routine and a life built specifically to avoid this exact feeling of wanting something he couldn't have. "I'll make up the guest room," he said finally, standing up. "You'll want to get an early start." Victoria caught his hand as he walked past. "Daniel," he stopped, looked down at where her fingers wrapped around his, and felt his carefully constructed walls starting to crack. "Yeah? Thank you," she said, "for everything. This wasn't just about the storm or having a place to stay. You helped me see something I'd been avoiding." "What's that?" "That running away and moving forward aren't the same thing." She let go of his hand and stood up. "I should probably pack." Daniel watched her walk to the guest room and told himself this was for the best. Clean break, no complications, back to normal tomorrow. But as he lay in bed that night, listening to the creak outside his window, normal felt like the last thing he wanted. Victoria left just after sunrise. Daniel made coffee and toast, and they ate mostly in silence, both of them pretending this was just a casual goodbye between people who'd helped each other out during a storm. She shouldered her bag, thanked him again, and walked down the trail toward town. Daniel stood on his porch and watched until she disappeared around the bend, then went inside and tried to pretend everything was fine. But everything wasn't fine. The cabin felt different now, empty in a way it hadn't before. He saw Victoria everywhere. The couch where she'd sat looking through her photos. The kitchen where they'd cooked together. The trail where she'd taught him to really see things instead of just looking at them. He'd gotten so good at being alone that he'd forgotten what it felt like to want someone's company, and now that feeling sat in his chest like a stone. A week passed, then 2. They texted occasionally. Victoria sent photos from Iceland, gorgeous shots of glaciers and northern lights and tiny fishing villages. Daniel sent pictures of the mountains, trying to capture them the way she would, finding beauty in details he'd walked past 1,000 times. The texts were friendly but careful, both of them dancing around what had happened between them, neither willing to be the first to admit it meant something. Daniel threw himself into work, taking on extra projects, anything to keep his mind busy. But at night, when the cabin was quiet and the fire burned low, he'd find himself thinking about her. The way she laughed, the way she looked at the world with such curiosity and hope despite everything she'd lost, the way she'd challenged him without pushing, just by being authentically herself. Meanwhile, Victoria was having her own crisis halfway around the world. Iceland was beautiful, and she got the shots she needed for her assignment, but something had changed. For the first time in 2 years, the constant movement felt exhausting rather than exciting. She'd catch herself thinking about the cabin, about the sound of rain on the roof, about conversations by the fire with someone who actually understood what she was running from. In Morocco, she found herself photographing couples walking hand in hand through the Medina. In Chile, she captured families laughing together on the beach. Her portfolio, which had always focused on landscapes and solitude, suddenly seemed full of connection and relationships. Her editor noticed. "These are beautiful," he said over a video call, "but they're different from your usual work. More intimate somehow, more human." Victoria looked at the photos on her screen and realized he was right. She wasn't just documenting places anymore. She was documenting the thing she'd been running from, the thing Daniel had helped her see, that being alone and being at peace weren't the same thing. December rolled into January, and Daniel's cabin got buried in snow. He shoveled the path to his truck, kept the fire going, and tried to convince himself he was happy. But he wasn't. The quiet he'd sought for 3 years now felt suffocating. He started taking longer walks, going into town more often, even accepting an invitation to dinner with some of the locals he'd been avoiding. They didn't comment on the change, but he saw the knowing looks they exchanged. One evening, he was looking through his phone and found the photo he'd taken at the waterfall, the one Victoria had coached him through, the rainbows in the mist. He remembered how he'd felt in that moment, present and alive in a way he'd forgotten was possible. And he realized something that should have been obvious from the start. He hadn't been healing up here. He'd been hiding. There was a difference, and Victoria had shown it to him just by walking into his life. He opened his laptop and started looking at jobs, remote positions that would let him work from anywhere, contracts that required travel. His heart pounded as he updated his resume, applied for positions, reached out to old contacts. It felt terrifying and necessary, like stepping off a cliff and hoping he'd learn to fly. Victoria was in Portugal for Christmas, staying with her parents for the first time since Sophia died. Being in her childhood home was harder than she'd expected. Everything reminded her of her sister. But instead of running this time, she let herself feel it. She cried with her mother, looked through old photo albums with her father, visited Sophia's grave, and talked to her about Daniel and the cabin and how confusing everything felt. "Sophia would have liked him," her mother said one evening as they sat in the kitchen drinking tea. "She always said you needed someone who could keep up with your spirit but also help you find ground when you needed it." "I don't even know if he feels the same way," Victoria said. "We were together for 3 days during a storm. Maybe it was just circumstance." Her mother gave her that look, the one that mothers have perfected over generations. "Do you really believe that?" Victoria thought about the conversations, the laughter, the way Daniel had opened up to her, the way she'd felt safe enough to open up to him. "No," she admitted, "but I don't know how to make it work. His life is there, and my life is everywhere." "So change your life," her mother said simply. "You've been running for 2 years, sweetheart. Maybe it's time to run towards something instead of away from it." New Year's Eve came, and Victoria sat in her parents' house watching the celebration on television, feeling more alone than she had in months. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her texts with Daniel. The messages had grown further apart over the last few weeks, both of them seemingly afraid to say what they were really feeling. She started typing a message 3 different times and deleted it each time. Finally, she just wrote, "Happy New Year. I miss talking to you." She hit send before she could change her mind, then sat there staring at her phone like a teenager. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, his response came through. "I miss you too. More than I thought possible." Victoria's heart jumped. She typed quickly, "I'm in Portugal, but I've been thinking about coming back to the States, maybe staying for a while instead of just passing through." The response took longer this time. When it came, it was just an address and a simple message. "If you mean that, you know where to find me." Victoria looked at the address, the cabin. She checked flights on her laptop, found one leaving the next morning, and booked it without letting herself overthink it. Then she called her mother into the room. "I need to borrow a coat," she said. "A really warm one. I'm going back to the mountains." The flight felt endless. Victoria changed planes in New York, then Denver, then took a puddle jumper to the small regional airport nearest to Daniel's town. She rented a car and drove through snow-covered roads, second-guessing herself the entire way. What if she'd misread everything? What if 3 days together during a storm didn't mean what she thought it meant? What if he'd moved on, realized he preferred his solitude after all? But she kept driving, because running away had gotten her nowhere, and running toward something, even if it was scary, felt like the right kind of fear for once, the kind that meant growth instead of hiding. It was late afternoon when she pulled up to the cabin. Smoke rose from the chimney and she could see lights on inside. She sat in the car for a moment, gathering her courage, and then grabbed her single backpack and walked up to the door. She knocked before she could lose her nerve. The door opened, and there was Daniel, looking surprised and hopeful and uncertain all at once. His hair was a bit longer, and he had more color in his face than he'd had in October, like he'd been spending more time outside. "Hi," Victoria said, and her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. "I know I should have called, but I was afraid if I did, I'd talk myself out of coming, and I've spent 2 years running away from things, and I just couldn't do it anymore." Daniel stepped aside without a word, and she walked into the cabin, the warmth and familiarity of it hitting her like a hug. She turned to face him, and the words came tumbling out. "I've been all over the world in the last 3 months," she said. "Iceland and Morocco and Chile and a dozen other places, and all I could think about was this cabin and you and how for 3 days I felt more at home than I have anywhere in 2 years. I don't have answers about how this would work. I don't know how to stop moving, but I want to try if you're willing to meet me halfway." Daniel closed the door and leaned against it, studying her face. Victoria held her breath, waiting for him to say something, anything. The silence stretched out until she couldn't stand it anymore. "If you want me to leave, just say so," she said quietly. "I won't make this weird. I'll go back to town and catch a flight tomorrow, and we can pretend this never happened." "Victoria," Daniel said, and his voice was rough with emotion, "I don't want you to leave. I've spent the last 3 months dismantling everything I built up here. I took a new job that lets me work remotely from anywhere. I've been learning basic Portuguese on an app. I even started looking at plane tickets, though I wasn't sure where I'd go or if you'd want to see me if I showed up." "You what?" Victoria felt tears starting in her eyes. "You were going to come find me?" "I was trying to work up the courage," Daniel admitted. 3 years I've spent hiding in this cabin, convincing myself that being alone was the same as being at peace. Then you walked up that trail and showed me the difference. You made me remember who I used to be, who I still could be. And I realized that healing doesn't mean cutting yourself off from everything. Sometimes it means being brave enough to try again." Victoria crossed the space between them and took his hands in hers. "I'm terrified," she said honestly. I don't know how to do this, how to be still, how to let someone in, but I want to learn. With you. Daniel pulled her into a hug, and Victoria felt something in her chest finally relax, like a fist that had been clenched for 2 years was finally opening. They stood like that for a long time, just holding each other while the fire crackled and snow fell softly outside. I have an idea, Daniel said eventually, pulling back to look at her. What if home wasn't a place? What if it was just us, wherever we are? You can keep photographing the world. And I can work from anywhere with internet. We could travel together, spend time in the mountains when we need quiet, go wherever your assignments take you. No more running away, just moving forward together. Victoria laughed through her tears. That sounds completely impractical and impossible to plan, and probably a disaster waiting to happen. Is that a yes? That's definitely a yes, she said, and kissed him while the snow fell outside and the fire warmed the cabin and everything that had felt broken started to feel like maybe, just maybe, it could be whole again. They spent New Year's Eve talking through the details, making plans that were half practical and half dreaming. Victoria showed him her upcoming assignment schedule. Daniel showed her the job offer he'd accepted, working for a company that didn't care where he logged in from. They talked about keeping the cabin as a home base, a place to come back to when they needed roots. They talked about all the places they wanted to see together, the photos she wanted to take, the life they could build that honored both their needs. 6 months later, they were standing on a beach in Portugal, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Victoria had her camera out, capturing the moment, while Daniel stood behind her with his hands in his pockets, just watching. They'd spent the last few months finding their rhythm. A month in Iceland, where Victoria taught a photography workshop and Daniel worked from coffee shops. 2 weeks back at the cabin fixing the roof and chopping wood. A month in Japan where they both fell in love with the temples and the food and the careful way people tended their gardens. Got it, Victoria said, lowering her camera with satisfaction. That light was perfect. Daniel wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. You say that about every sunset. That's because every sunset is perfect if you're paying attention, she said, leaning back against him. You taught me that. Pretty sure you taught me that, Daniel said with a laugh. Then we taught each other, Victoria said. That's how this works, right? They watched the sun disappear into the ocean, and Daniel thought about that October evening when Victoria had walked up to his porch, lost and looking for direction. He'd offered her shelter from a storm, never imagining she'd end up being the one to shelter him, to show him that the life he'd been hiding from was the one worth living. That destiny wasn't about one person walking into your life, it was about 2 people choosing every single day to walk forward together. Ready to go home? Victoria asked, turning in his arms to face him. Where's home this week? Daniel asked with a smile. Wherever you are, she said simply, and took his hand as they walked back up the beach. 2 people who'd been broken and lost finding their way together, one step at a time.